talk. So if you haven't noticed, something that I do on my channel is I separate the things that we talk about, the different conversations that we have, into different talks. So this will be a spiritual talk because we're going to start the book of Colossians during this video. This video will be an intro into the book of Colossians. I'm going to explain the message and the purpose, the contribution that Colossians is to the Bible as a whole, why it should matter to you today, who wrote it, when it was written, all of the context that you will need so that as we go through the 4 chapters of Colossians, everything will make sense and it will be clear. So this is everything you need to know about the book of Colossians. Colossians was written by Paul. If you don't know who Paul is, he is a Roman Jew, so a Jew that lived in Rome, in the city of Rome, and he actually was saved, and his salvation story is in the book of Acts, by the way, but it's pretty miraculous the way that God drew Paul to himself. So Paul was a persecutor of Christians. He openly persecuted followers of Christ, and we know for a fact because at the beginning of Acts we see the first martyr, the death of the first martyr, and that was Stephen, and Paul had a hand in Stephen's death. So that's a pretty rough rap sheet for Paul. Definitely not your typical,
"Hi, I was raised in church, I got saved when I was 7, and life is pretty good."
Paul had a lot of baggage, I guess you could say. But that didn't mean anything to God. Paul's salvation story is really, really encouraging. Colossians is one of the 4 letters that we know of that was written while Paul was in a Roman prison. We identify Colossians as one of Paul's letters because in the first chapter, Paul identifies himself as the author, along by mentioning Timothy, his protege. And as if that is not enough proof of authorship, the book of Colossians shows a considerable amount of grammatical and theological similarities along with the book of Philemon, which is definitely known as being one of Paul's letters. While Paul was in Ephesus, he sent Epaphras to Lycus Valley to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ there. This is when we establish the church at Colossae. Epaphras founded this church at Colossae, and they are known as the Colossians. The church was mostly composed of Gentile members, according to chapters 1 and 2, but still had some Jewish converts, if you read deeper into chapter 2, which we will. Epaphras informed Paul that there was heretical teaching going on in the area, and then it had leaked into the church, into the congregation as well. When I say heretical teaching, I just mean false teaching. I'll try to just say false teaching. Heresy is what the root word of that word is. False teaching. Paul wrote the book of Colossians in an effort to correct this false teaching and to kind of tear down the lies between the Hellenistic views that were being spread there, and I'll define that in a minute. Paul wrote this letter during his first Roman imprisonment in the early AD 60s. So this was 60 years after the death and resurrection of Christ. So the false teaching that Paul is attempting to tear down is identified in chapter 2, verse 8 as philosophy. Scholars understand this to be drawn from some form of Hellenistic tradition, meaning Greek culture. This included the worship of ancient Greek gods. There are several words that prove that view by biblical scholars to be true, and I will list a few of those for you. The term elemental forces used in chapter 2, wisdom used in chapter 2 verse 3, ascetic practices used in chapter 2 verse 23. So this false teaching also contained elements of Judaism, which is strange because this church was full of Gentiles and of Jews. So for example, the word circumcision in chapter 2 and human tradition in chapter 2, Sabbath observance, food regulation, festival participation, all of that found in chapter 2, worship of angels together with access to some visionary realm in chapter 2, and harsh human regulations. Paul addressed this heresy by re-explaining the gospel of Jesus and explaining how Christians are expected to live. So what does Colossians contribute to the Bible? Colossians provides one of the Bible's fullest expressions of the deity and supremacy of Christ. Deity meaning Jesus is fully God. He is God's Son, and he is himself God in the flesh. And supremacy of Christ, meaning that he is above all first. This, of course, is most clear in the wonderful hymn in chapter 1, verses 15 through 20, and we will read that during our next video. But it says that Christ is the image of the invisible God, the creator and sustainer of the universe, the head of his body, which is the church. Colossians contributes a high Christology, and Christology is the branch of Christian theology relating to the person, nature, and role of Christ. So Colossians does a really good job of establishing who Christ is and a presentation of its implications for the believer's conduct. So Paul attempts to explain, well, he does explain, he doesn't attempt. Paul explains that Christ is fully God, he has full supremacy, and this is how believers are to conduct themselves. Considering the gospel of Christ, this is what we do with it. Let's talk about the structure of Colossians. You could divide Colossians into two different parts. The first, chapters 1 verse 3 through 2 verse 23, is press against false teachings, basically. The second, chapter 3 verse 1 through chapter 4 verse 17, is made up of exhortations to proper Christian living, so a push to live in good conduct as a Christian. Apparently, this is Paul's typical approach to writing. He begins by establishing theology and stating the gospel of Christ, and then moves into using that as a foundation for exhortation. We will probably be splitting up Colossians into 4 different videos since there are 4 chapters. I'm hoping to cover one whole chapter in one video. It could possibly be 5, depending on whether or not I want to split chapter 3. One of my New Year's goals this year is to strive to know God's character better and to try to understand my position to God as a believer. So one of the things we're going to do throughout these Colossians videos is attempt to identify who God is. So who is God saying that he is? Who is Paul explaining God as? If that makes sense, as we move through Colossians. I'm going to define every word I can possibly think that might need to be defined as we go through the book. I want this to be as understandable as possible, and I believe that the context of every book of the Bible is extremely important to understanding its purpose and its mission for you. That is the point to me, to actually know the Bible and know God so that you can keep the commands that God's given us. You must understand to be able to obey. As I was scanning through the book of Colossians, preparing to give you some context, I was really encouraged by Paul's attitude toward the Colossians. I'm very excited to cover this book with you, and I think it's going to be a great learning experience for all parties involved. As always, don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. Click the bell notification so that you don't miss any more videos during this series. So let's review. Colossians was written by Paul, a Jewish convert whose name used to be Saul. Paul wrote Colossians in the AD 60s to the church at Colossae, established by Epaphras, one of Paul's fellow missionaries. He wrote this letter during his first Roman imprisonment, and the purpose of Colossians was to address the heresy that was being passed around in the church and in the area during that time. Like I said, the false teaching, scholars believe it to be because of the words that I mentioned to you from chapters 2 and chapters 3. Scholars believe it to be influenced by Hellenistic tradition, so Greek culture. which would make sense because this is a short time after the conquest of Alexander the Great in the 4th century, when the Greek culture had spread across that area. Colossians' contribution to the Bible is that it presents the fullest expression of the deity and the supremacy of Christ. Deity meaning Christ is fully God, and supremacy meaning Christ is above all. It also contributes a high Christology, so just explaining and studying the person and nature of Christ. It prevents clear implications of that fact for believers' conduct. And that is everything you need to know about the book of Colossians. So in our next video, we will dive right into chapter 1. So I hope that you will tune in then, and I'll see you next time.